All right, so today, let's do a deep dive into Portuguese. We're going way beyond the usual fifth most spoken language stuff, right? Because you've given me a ton of excerpts and articles on it.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. So much history there,
Mhm.
empires, explorers. It's all there in the
And
language.
it's a Romance language, right?
Exactly. Like Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese had those Roman Empire roots.
So where do we even start with a language like that? I
Well,
mean,
and it all goes back to the Romans, right?
yeah,
They get to the Iberian Peninsula around 200 BC. Latin starts spreading their version of Latin, at least.
makes sense. A massive empire like that.
Exactly. And so, as you might imagine, variations pop up. Different regions, they develop their own little quirks with the language.
Kind of like how we have regional dialects today, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Only this is on a way bigger scale, right? Over hundreds of years, the Latin spoken on the Iberian Peninsula. Well, it takes on a life of its own.
Yeah.
And that's how we end up with Portuguese and the other languages that we were talking about.
Okay, so that's how we get Portuguese in a nutshell. But what makes it special? What sets it apart in the family of Romance languages?
Well, think of it this way. Imagine if we had a time machine for language, a way to hear the way the Romans actually spoke. Portuguese might be the closest we get to that.
Hold on, really?
Seriously. You see, unlike some other Romance languages, Portuguese has held on to some really specific vowel sounds. And these aren't just any sounds. They're from what linguists call vulgar Latin.
Vulgar Latin, huh? Sounds a little rough around the edges.
Well, the name might sound a little harsh, but it just refers to the everyday language of the common people back then. So in a way, it's like Portuguese gives us this direct line to the ancient world, a way to hear echoes of how the Romans actually communicated.
That's wild. It's like Portuguese is this living time capsule. Okay, but it wasn't just the Romans who left their mark on the language, right? I mean, the Iberian Peninsula, it's got this whole layered history, even before the Romans, right?
Absolutely. You're thinking of the Celts, right? They were there way before the Romans showed up.
Yeah, I remember reading something about Celtic influences.
Right. So before Latin even enters the picture, you've got Celtic languages being spoken there. And even though they eventually faded for the most part, it's not like they completely vanished without a trace.
So they left some souvenirs behind.
Exactly. Linguistic souvenirs, you could say. Like the word cama, for example. It means bed in Portuguese, and linguists believe it has Celtic roots.
Wow. So the story of Portuguese was already being written even before the Romans got there. But then didn't things take a pretty dramatic turn with the Moors?
Oh, absolutely. We can't talk about the Iberian Peninsula, especially Portugal, without talking about the Moors. Their influence on the culture, massive.
Yeah.
And their language, well, that's a whole other chapter in the story of
So
Portuguese.
you're saying we hear echoes of that today in modern Portuguese.
Without a doubt. Think about words like alface for lettuce or armazém, which means warehouse. Those words have Arabic origins, remnants of that incredible cultural exchange that went down.
That just goes to show you a language is never really just one thing. It's like this tapestry of influences, always changing.
And nowhere is that more evident than in what happens next, the Age of Discovery. This is where Portuguese really goes global, you know what I mean?
Oh, yeah. Portuguese explorers, setting sail, reaching new lands, their language going along for the ride.
And let me tell you, it wasn't just a sightseeing trip for the language. It played a huge role in how Portuguese spread and transformed the world. But I think we should save that part of the story for after a quick break.
Okay, so Portuguese explorers, new worlds, the language going global. Where do we even start with that?
So just picture it. Portuguese ships reaching the coast of Africa, crossing the Atlantic to the Americas, landing in India.
Yeah, and eventually pushing even further east, right? Southeast Asia, even Japan.
It's incredible. And their language, it wasn't just along for the ride, it was essential.
Yeah.
How do you explore, trade, build relationships with people who speak totally different languages?
Right, that makes sense.
Language was the bridge, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes that bridge, well, it led to the creation of entirely new paths.
You're talking about Creole languages, aren't you? Those fascinating blends of languages that emerge from contact.
That's it. And Portuguese played a key role in a lot of them. Think about Cristang, for instance. It's spoken in Malacca, Malaysia.
Malacca, okay. And Cristang, that's a Creole with Portuguese.
Yeah, a blend of Portuguese and Malay, shaped by centuries of interaction. I mean, imagine hearing someone say, "Yo fala Cristang." That's "I speak Cristang."
Wow. So these linguistic echoes from those early encounters are still being spoken today. That's amazing. But it wasn't just about new languages forming, right? I mean, Portuguese picked up some souvenirs along the way too, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It was a two-way street for sure.
Yeah.
As Portuguese explorers encountered new cultures, they didn't just bring back spices and goods, right? They brought back words too.
Like katana, right, for cutlass.
Exactly. And how about cha?
Oh yeah, for tea.
These words, they represented new things, new experiences. They were like linguistic souvenirs from their travels. And these souvenirs, they found their way into European languages, including Portuguese.
It's like each word has a whole story behind it. But we can't talk about the global journey of Portuguese without talking about Brazil, right? Brazilian Portuguese. With its music, its rhythm, it almost feels like its own world.
It's remarkable, isn't it? I mean, it all starts with that same journey across the Atlantic, that shared history with European Portuguese.
But then it evolves, right? Takes on its own personality.
That's it. The thing is, the Portuguese language in Brazil, it wasn't just shaped by the explorers and colonists.
You're talking about the slave trade, right?
It's a dark chapter, no doubt. But to understand Brazilian Portuguese, you have to understand the impact of the slave trade. Think about the sheer numbers so many Africans brought to Brazil, far outnumbering the Portuguese colonists.
And they brought their languages with them?
Exactly. Languages mainly from West and Central Africa, mingling with Portuguese, influencing its pronunciation, its rhythm, even its vocabulary.
It's a reminder of how language, it's not just about words, it reflects history, the beautiful and the painful.
No doubt. And within Brazil itself, as people moved, different regions developed their own ways of speaking, creating this incredibly diverse linguistic tapestry.
Like with the pronoun você, right, for you.
Exactly. That one's a great example. In some parts of Brazil, você is the go-to way to say you. But in European Portuguese, they make a clearer distinction between formal and informal you.
It's amazing how one language can have so many different flavors.
And let's not forget, Portuguese is still evolving, spoken on 5 continents. Its story is being written right now as we speak.
It's like we're living through a Portuguese renaissance. I mean, we always think about its history, but it's everywhere today. People speaking it, studying it all over the world.
It's true. You know that period of colonialism, it may be over, but the language, it's taken on a life of its own.
Yeah, and it's interesting how it's viewed now. Like in a lot of places, it's this language of opportunity.
Absolutely. Yeah, education, business, you name it. Portuguese opens doors.
Which brings us back to Timor-Leste. Talk about a powerful statement. They choose Portuguese as an official language after gaining independence. I mean, wow, right?
Right, and it makes perfect sense for them. It wasn't just symbolic, though. That was a big part of it for sure. But connecting with other Portuguese-speaking nations, being able to tap into those resources, it's been huge. I mean, look at how many Portuguese speakers there are in Timor-Leste now. It's really taken off, especially with the focus on language education.
It makes you realize language, it's not just about communication, it's about shaping your future, about connecting with the world. Well, we certainly covered a lot of ground today, from those ancient roots in the Iberian Peninsula to this global language we see today. It's quite the journey.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Language, it's more than just words on a page, right? It's a reflection of history, of culture, of all these interactions that have shaped us.
It's like you said earlier, a tapestry.
Yeah. And when you really listen to a language like Portuguese,
Yeah.
I mean, really listen, it's like you can hear echoes of everything we've talked about.
It's true. The explorers, the music of Brazil, the different dialects, it's all there.
It's like this incredible symphony, And it just goes to show you, with language, the exploration never really ends.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And on that note, I want to thank you, the listeners, for joining us on this deep dive into the incredible world of the Portuguese language. We hope you've gained a newfound appreciation for this global language and its fascinating journey through time. Until next time.